Hi everyone, this is Diego Martin from BeSpoken, and to continue our collaboration with Dabble, today I'll show you the easiest way to write unit tests for your Alexa skills. If you haven't already, the first thing that we'll need to do is to install the latest version of the BeSpoken Tools library, also known as BST. With that out of the way, what I have here is a simple fax skill that we already worked on in our latest video. But if you haven't seen it, what this skill does is to just basically return a random space fact from an array of data. Now, the main handler on this skill is called getNewFact handler, and it will respond to the launch request, to the getNewFact intent, and to the Amazon Yes intent. Since our latest video, I added a slot to this intent. That slot is called Solar System Member, and if it is fulfilled, then we're going to get a specific fact regarding that slot's value. But if it's not, then we're just going to get a random fact like we already did before. Now, in order to create our unit tests, we need to set up a couple of things first. First of all, let's create a folder called test, and inside of it, a file called testing.json. This file is going to store global configurations for all of our tests. But for now, I want you just to fill this property called handler, which should point to the entry point of your skill. So in our case, that would be index.js. BeSpoken's unit test solution uses YAML scripts in order to write unit tests. So let's create a file called index.test.yaml. And on this file, we can define multiple sections for our unit test, provided that we start by typing 3 dashes. But the first section that we need to define is called configuration. And on this section, we can define multiple properties that will only affect this file. But for now, I just want you to set up the locales configuration, and that should be set to n-us. And why is this important? Well, that's because this ties this file to our n-us interaction model. We can finally start writing our first unit test now. Let's define a new section, and we're going to type test, and we're going to give a name to this test. I'm going to call it launch the space fax skill. So here's where the good stuff begins. In order to access the launch request, we just need to type launch request and follow that by a colon. Next, we are going to type here the prompt that we expect to receive from this launch request. We know from the code in our main handler that all messages start by here's your fact. So let's type that. And we can follow that with a star. Let's open up a terminal and test it. In our main folder, what we're going to type is just bst test. And here we have the results. Our first test, launch the space fax skill, has successfully passed. And we can find here all the files that have been tested, as well as the percentage of statements, functions, and lines that have been covered, and also the line numbers that have not been covered. And finally, the number of test suites and tests that have been executed, and in this case, that have passed. If we go back to our code editor, we're going to find a new folder called coverage under the test folder. And what this folder has is an HTML report of our code coverage. Opening this file will reveal the same information that we found on the console earlier, but we can access the index.js file this time to find much more detailed information about which lines were covered and which ones were not. Let's go back to our code and add a second test. This time I want to test the help intent. I'm going to call this launch and ask for help. I don't want to test the results that come back from the launch request this time, so I'm just going to leave that blank. And in order to tie this to an intent, I need to type the name of that intent. In this case, Amazon.help.int. I'm going to type here, what can I do for you? Now let's try this. We'll go back to the console and type bst test again and wait for the results. We can see that the coverage has increased. However, we have one test that failed. And it failed because we were expecting, what can I do for you? However, we received something else. This is really useful because this helps us fix our tests pretty quickly. So let's do that. And voila, that was really easy. So far, we've tested two cases when a slot is not needed. What if we want to include a slot? Well, this is how we do it. As you might remember, I added a slot called Solar System Member to the Get New Fact intent. So this is the way to call it. You just put the name of the intent followed by the name of the slot, then equals, and then the value of the slot. I'm asking for a fact about Mars, so I'm expecting Mars to be part of the response. Let's try that pretty quickly and see if that worked. And it did. Let's take this one step further. Going back to our first test, we put in here's your fact because we know that was fixed in the responses that came back from the launch request. But what if we didn't have that part? What if the responses could be variable all the time? In that case, we would put in place a test like this one. This test is launching the skill and testing multiple valid responses. So we are invoking once again the launch request, but we are adding this property, prompt. And on this property, we are defining multiple valid responses that could come back from it. Finally, prompts are not the only thing that we can test. We can actually do assertions against any property included in the responses that come back from Alexa, like this. In this other test, I'm testing the card title and also the SSML of the reprompt when we do a launch request. So let's try that. Now you might be wondering, how did I know what to put in here? To do that, we can actually help you by going into the testing.json file and setting another property. This property is called trace, and we are going to set it to true. When this is true, BSC test will print to the console all the requests and responses that are generated by our unit tests. I don't want to see that for all of my tests. So in this case, I just want to test this one. And I'm going to do that by adding that only to this test. Let's run this. This time, only one test is going to be run. 4 tests have been skipped. And we can see right here the request that we sent to Alexa and the response that we got from it. And if we take a moment to look at it, we can see that we have the response, reprompt, output speech, and the SSML that we just did an assertion against. Also, we have other properties like card title, the prompt that we tested earlier, the card content, and more. So to be more specific, the way in which we did an assertion against did SSML was using JSON-Path. And you can use JSON-Path expressions to do assertions against any part of the response. So to end this video, while I remove the only and the trace property, let me tell you how all of this magic works. Well, at BeSpoken, we developed an Alexa emulator that we called Virtual Alexa. Thanks to Virtual Alexa and to a specialized version of Jest that we are using for these tests, we are able to do these tests much more quickly than testing against Alexa itself. As you've seen throughout this video, you can run this test locally without the need of doing constant and slow deployments. Finally, I invite you to go into read.bespoken.io where you'll find an in-depth guide both for Alexa skill and for Google Actions. In here, you'll find much more complex cases like writing multi-locale skills or intercepting the requests and responses that come back from the tests so that you can simulate requests that need account linking and other useful features that are pretty common when developing Alexa skills. But don't worry, as we are going to cover most of these cases in future videos. And that's it. If you found this video helpful, please like it and subscribe to the channel, where you'll find over 120 other Alexa tutorials. And if you have any other questions regarding the BeSpoken tools, feel free to reach out to us at bespoken.io. Thank you and see you soon.